So good evening, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to come back and talk to Wincham again. So this is a relatively short talk. It's not a full hour. It'll be a little bit less than that, looking at the idea behind the Star of Bethlehem. So I'll be recapping, just very briefly, the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Let me just get a touch of focus there. There we go. I'll be recapping the Gospel of St. Matthew and talking about what's in the account of the Magi and the star in the east. And then we'll be looking at possible astronomical candidates for the Star of Bethlehem. How many possibilities are there? And how well do they fit the account of the star in the Gospel? And then we'll be looking at dates, thinking about what actually happened when, and do known events actually fit any of the timeline of the Nativity according to the Bible. And then, in order to get our facts right, I'll just run a couple of videos from planetarium software called Starry Night, and we'll rewind the clock back to a few years BC to see what was in the sky around about the time of the birth of Jesus. And then I'll summarize at the end. So let's get the account sorted first. What is it we are trying to explain when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem? Well, the principal elements of Matthew's account, I'm just highlighting in red in the following here. So the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem, and one of the things we have to explain is they were prompted to travel to Jerusalem by the appearance of a star in the east. Notice that it doesn't actually say they followed a star in the east, because of course that wouldn't have taken them to Jerusalem if they came from the east. But they were prompted by the appearance of a star in the east, so we have to explain that. And then they decided to travel west towards Jerusalem, where they asked Herod about what's this we hear from the signs in the stars about a new king being born, the new king of the Jews. Well, Herod was unaware of what they were talking about. So another red flag there is we have to explain the existence of the star, the fact that they thought that that was a sign of the king of the Jews, and that Herod wasn't aware of what they were talking about. So they journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star apparently reappeared in the sky and stopped over Bethlehem. So those 5 things in red are the 5 things we're trying to account for, and we're asking, are there any astronomical events around about the right time that could possibly tick those 5 boxes for the 5 items highlighted in red? So let's just remind ourselves of the lyrics for the opening verse. That's enough, as you've already heard it once this evening. But when we think of the Star of Bethlehem, we often think of the Christmas carol, the 3 Kings. But bear in mind that in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, indeed in the Bible, there is no mention of 3 of these people visiting Jesus. So it's often depicted as 3, simply because it is mentioned that 3 gifts were brought. As we all know, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So if 3 gifts were brought, it's often assumed that there were 3 visitors from the east to come and pay homage to Jesus, the baby Jesus. But that's just an assumption. 3 gifts, therefore there must have been 3 people, as opposed to there were definitely 3 gifts in the account, but does that mean that there were 20 people arriving and only 3 of them brought gifts and the other 17 didn't get the memo? So we don't actually know whether or not there were 3 or not. So we really shouldn't have 3 in the 3 Kings carol. And nowhere does it talk about kings in the account of St. Matthew, in the Gospel of St. Matthew. There's no account of kings visiting. It's only 3 magi, 3 wise men. So we shouldn't talk about kings either. Where did these 3 people come from, or these indeterminate number of people come from? Well, we don't know. It might have been Persia, it might have been India, it might have been further to the east, but there's no indication that it was necessarily from the Orient, unless you think of the Orient as a very vague term meaning over there somewhere. So we shouldn't talk about 3 kings from the Orient, because there weren't 3, they weren't kings, and they didn't come from the Orient. And they were prompted by the appearance of a star. And so when following yonder star, well, no, strictly speaking, they didn't follow the star in the sense that the star in the east prompted them to make the journey. They didn't follow the star in the east. So you can see the Christmas carol is very rapidly falling to pieces because most of what we sing is not actually in the original account. It just makes good verse, as it were. Now, I'm a physicist, therefore I think that things ought to be accurate. So rather than talking about we three kings of Orient are, we really ought to change the lyrics to something more accurate. So, for instance, we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are is more accurate. And it's better to say we saw a star rather than following yonder star. And, sorry?
Could have been some women there as well.
No, Magi was a male. The original Greek, I am told, because I'm not a Greek scholar, the original Greek is a male. So it says 3 wise men, not 3 wise people, is the original translation. Bear in mind it's been translated a number of times from the Greek to the Latin to the English, but I'm assuming that the translations have worked. So you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols, because although that is actually more accurate, it certainly doesn't meter quite as well as we three kings of Orient are. And when we talk about the 3 wise men, yes, men rather than women, but we shouldn't talk about the 3 wise men. We should really talk about the n wise men, where n is a number greater than 1 because it's plural, but less than infinity, and we don't really know what the upper limit is. So n is a number somewhere between 1 and infinity, so n wise men is a good enough description. And when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem, we must remember that star isn't used in the same sense in the Bible as it would be in modern usage. So it means something in the night sky, basically. To us, a star means something like the sun, something that is not shining by reflected light, but is generating its own light. But here we use star in the much more general sense. For instance, we can think about a wandering star. A wandering star is not those fixed stars. The stars aren't fixed in the sense of position in the sky, but in the sense of positions relative to each other. So the constellations appear to move as the planet rotates, as our planet rotates. So we would call those fixed stars, but any stars that move relative to the background of fixed stars would be called wandering stars, and of course we now name them planets, and we know what they're doing in terms of orbits around the sun. And it's been long known that some stars are hairy. They have tails. They're like cats. They have tails and they're unpredictable. So hairy stars, what we now call comets, pieces of ice that are evaporating as they approach the sun and produce tails. And shooting stars, that's actually a misnomer, but of course that has stayed with us to the present day. So although we tend to call them meteors, it's not uncommon to call them shooting stars. And so here we have 3 examples of a description of a star which is not strictly a star in the sense that we would use them today. So we have to remember that star means something in the night sky. So when we talk about the Star of Bethlehem, we shouldn't limit ourselves to only stars. We should also think about, could it have been a planet, could it have been a comet, could it have been a meteor? Because all of those would fit into the right category. Do we get any clues by looking at what's gone on since the birth of Christ? If we look at any depiction of the adoration of the Magi, we always find there's 3, because that is so ingrained that there were 3 gifts, therefore there were 3 Magi. That's so ingrained that you'll never find a painting with 6 or 7 or 23 Magi. It's always 3. And usually in depictions, this one is obviously only a few hundred years old, so it's nowhere near the Nativity itself, but always in these sorts of depictions you find something in the background which is usually a depiction of the Star of Bethlehem. In here it looks like perhaps a star, and perhaps the star is beaming down onto the baby Jesus there. This famous one by Botticelli, this is supposedly Botticelli photobombing his own painting here, sort of self-portrait in the right-hand side. You can see there's Joseph at the back. That's presumably the Star of Bethlehem just above Joseph. Joseph looks very bored in this particular painting. He doesn't seem to be taking part in the celebration at all. Maybe that's appropriate, because allegedly he didn't take part in the conception either. So that's probably all well and good. That, I guess, is the Star of Bethlehem, though it's very difficult to tell in some of these artwork depictions. Giotto is one of the few that actually seems to have indicated the Star of Bethlehem as what appears to be a comet, quite definitely something with a tail. Most of the time, the Star of Bethlehem appears, if it appears at all, just as a star, but Giotto was one of the few that actually depicted it as a comet. Rubens, I don't know why, but there doesn't seem to be any Star of Bethlehem at all in this particular adoration of the Magi. But there does appear to be a two-headed camel in the background there, watching over everybody else. And again, Star of Bethlehem, perhaps with a little bit of radiation pointing down to the baby Jesus, and again, star with a little bit of radiation pointing down onto the infant Jesus. So, of course, we don't learn much from looking at works of art because they are not documentaries of what happened. They are depictions of popular culture of the time, of a few hundred years ago. But we can ask ourselves about astrological significance. And this is always difficult for me to say, simply because I'm so used to making sure that I talk about astronomy rather than astrology. It's sometimes difficult to make sure I use the word astrological correctly. So let's remind ourselves how this might have been perceived in the very early parts of the last millennium. Every planet, every bright star, and every constellation, in particular the zodiac constellations through which the sun and the moon and the planets will move, either day by day or month by month, all of the planets and stars and constellations had some astrological significance. For instance, we can outline a few of them. Venus was a symbol of beauty, or a symbol of fertility, or a symbol of birth in various cultures. This is not something specific only to one culture. This was across quite a few different cultures. And Jupiter, because it was the brightest planet that occurs a long way from the sun, this is often depicting royalty. It's often thought to be the king of planets. We now know it is indeed the largest planet in the solar system, but even in the early days, because it was quite so bright in the night sky, then it often got depicted as representative of royalty and kingship. Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo, and you can tell from the name, perhaps starting REG, that this was considered the king of stars. So it's not an astoundingly bright star, but because of its position in a certain constellation, and because of its brightness, it was considered to be the king of stars. And Regulus is the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo is often depicted as a lion. Some of you are familiar with the constellation of Leo, sort of backwards question mark, a little bit like the head of a lion. And again, across different cultures, Leo, the constellation, is associated with a lion because of its similarity in shape. And that is often associated with Judea because the tribe of Judea, in the land of Judea, their flag had a lion on it, and therefore Leo became associated with the tribe of Judea, simply because of their flag representing their tribe. So why did astrologers continually place significance and meaning behind the identity of a planet and the identity of stars and the identity of constellations? Well, it was believed, as a minority believe today, that what happens in the sky is an indication of what God has in store for mankind. If there's going to be a flood or a famine or a war or something else, then the signs of that, the early prediction, the early indicators, will appear in the sky before it actually happens. So if you want to know what God has in store for mankind, you read the sky night after night to look for any signs of what's going to happen in the near future or the far future. One way of thinking of it is to think of the sky as God's Facebook page. This is where he posts stuff. So if you want to know what's going on, you keep an eye on the sky and then you know what's in store. So let's have a think about what candidates we have. What are the possibilities? We're going to think about what a possible candidate is, and then we'll ask ourselves, could it be interpreted as a star in the east? Could it have been thought of as significant? Is there a sensible reason why Herod wouldn't be aware of said event? Could the star reappear in the sky, and could the star stop in the sky? We'll consider each of those points, and first we'll think about meteors or a meteor shower. So, shooting stars. Is it possible that meteors could appear in the east? Could shooting stars appear in the east? Well, for those of you who've seen meteors, they appear all over the sky, effectively. And so, yes, they could appear in the east. It's not obvious why you would say a star appeared in the east if the stars shooting all over the sky in the east and the west and the north and the south. Why would you say a star appeared in the sky? Perhaps, unless there was a very bright one. Could it have been significant? Well, again, we know that meteor showers happen all the time. Big meteor showers come round every year, and there's quite a few of them every year. So there's no real reason to think of it as significant. So even if there was a meteor shower, it's not really obvious why you would think of that as being an important portent for the future. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of a meteor shower? Well, given that they happen all the time, there's no particular reason why Herod would have been thinking about that being a sign of there's a birth of the King of the Jews. So that's quite reasonable. Could the stars reappear in the sky? Well, the meteor showers come and go. For a few nights, there might be a lot of them, and then they die away, and then maybe a month later, another shower reappears. Not necessarily the same shower, but shooting stars will again appear in the sky. So yes, they can reappear in the sky. What about this idea of the star stopped over Bethlehem? Is there any way we can interpret a star stopping in the sky as being a result of a set of shooting stars? Doesn't really work, because we know that meteors flash across the sky in a fraction of a second, and so there's no way we can really interpret meteors as stopping in the sky. So meteors tick a couple, but there's definitely a couple that haven't been ticked there, so it doesn't look like meteors. What about the appearance of a comet? Could a comet appear in the east? Well, quite definitely that's possible. Yes, comets can in principle appear in all parts of the sky. Would it have been significant? Well, a bright enough comet would certainly have been considered significant. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware of said comet? Well, if it's bright enough to cause the astrologers in the Orient, wherever the Orient might be, to think about going to Jerusalem, how come when they got there, Herod, or at least his astrologers, weren't aware of this comet? Herod actually didn't have very good eyesight, but he would have had a court of astrologers who would have advised him. So if it was visible from the Orient, why wouldn't it have been visible from Herod's court? Could it reappear in the sky? Well, comets go around the sun, so for a while they're on one side of the sun, and then you can often lose sight of them as they go behind the sun, as seen from Earth, and then they would reappear on the other side of the sun sometime later. So it is possible for a comet to appear, apparently disappear, because you can't see it behind the sun, and then reappear in the sky. So a tick for that one. Comets will move around the sun, like virtually all other solar system objects, and it's not obvious how we would interpret the idea of the comet stopping in the sky. Comets don't necessarily move particularly fast relative to the background stars, but if it's not moving particularly fast, why would you say it's moving for some weeks or months, and then why would you say it apparently has stopped in the sky?
Could it have gone into retrograde then?
Comets go in one direction only. Oh, you mean relative to the Earth?
Yeah.
It depends on where the comet is and what its orbit is. In principle, it might be possible for it to sort of come in. When we look at comets that are going round the sun, when we plot them relative to Earth, they often do an S shape. Now, it doesn't actually, I don't think any comet has ever stopped in the sky, but they do occasionally do an S shape because of the retrograde motion. The reason comets don't do the same, for instance, as Mars is comets are, generally speaking, not in the ecliptic plane. So they usually come in at an angle, and so you've got the comet coming in at one angle and the Earth going at a different angle. Yeah. What about a nova, a new star? Technically not a new star, but a new star visibility, a star that was too faint to see up to some point and then brightened. In some cases, a nova can brighten quite substantially by many thousands of times, and so it might appear that a star has appeared where there didn't appear to be one before. Could a nova appear in the east? Yes, that's possible. Could it be regarded as significant, depending on how bright? If it was barely bright enough to see, it probably wouldn't have been thought of as significant, but if it was bright enough, maybe. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware? Well, you come back to the same argument. If it was seen as a new star appeared in the sky, and that was seen from one part of the world, why wouldn't it have also been seen from Jerusalem? And is it possible that it was seen but wasn't interpreted as being anything particularly interesting? Well, possibly, yes. Could a star reappear in the sky? Well, if a nova brightens substantially and then dims, it, generally speaking, doesn't brighten again. Yes, there are such things as recurrent nova, which get brighter and then fade away, and then possibly get brighter again. But usually, years or decades or hundreds of years later, not usually within a few months, which is what we're trying to deal with in the account of St. Matthew. And could it stop in the sky? Well, a nova is part of the fixed stars. Yes, it's new in the sense that it's only just appeared, but it will move with all the other stars as the night progresses because of the rotation of the Earth. A nova will not move relative to the background of fixed stars. So why, if it's not moving, would you say it has stopped in the sky? That doesn't seem to make an awful lot of sense. And for supernova, it's the same sort of idea. Supernova might be substantially brighter, but it might be substantially further away, so it might appear in the sky as no brighter than a nova would appear if it was a little bit closer. And so arguably the same sort of things apply. Yes, a supernova could have gone off in the east. It would have been significant, especially if it was relatively close to us. We don't have any evidence for a very close supernova going off. It would have been many hundreds, if not thousands of light years away if it was visible. And again, we come up with the argument, well, if it was spectacular enough to kick off the migration of the Magi to Jerusalem, why wasn't Herod or his court aware of the existence of this object? Could it reappear in the sky? Well, a supernova is usually a star coming to the end of its life. Once a star has blown itself to pieces, doesn't often do it again. Once it's dead, it's dead. So supernova generally do not go off twice. And the chance of one supernova going off and then another one going off a few months later as a second indicator, that just doesn't seem plausible. And again, a supernova would be a fixed point in the sky. So why would you say it stopped in the sky where clearly it has always been in a fixed position in the sky relative to the other stars? So far, we haven't got a particularly good candidate that ticks all the boxes, except for number 5, and this is where I'm heading. If we look at the conjunction of bright planets, where planets can come together in the sky, and in some cases can get very close, if you remember Saturn and Jupiter last year, for instance. So conjunctions. Could a conjunction of bright planets occur in the east? In principle, they can occur all over the sky, so quite definitely. Would it have been significant? We've already seen that astrological significance is applied to which planets moving in which constellations. So there will be astrological significance which might be valid. Is it possible that Herod wasn't aware? Well, Herod and his astrologers would have been aware of a conjunction, but they may not have applied the same significance. They may not have said this conjunction is a sign that there's going to be the birth of a new king of the Jews. Can a star reappear in the sky? Well, conjunctions, as we'll see in just a moment, involve planets going around the sun, and the alignment of planets can occur at a certain time and then can reoccur at a later time, maybe months, maybe years later. So conjunctions quite often can reappear in the sky. And is it possible for a star to stop in the sky? Well, if we take the interpretation of bright planets, such as Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, etc., as has already been mentioned, it is possible, because of the nature of how the Earth moves, for a planet to move through the sky and then stop, and then move backwards through the sky. We'll see that in just a second. So it is possible that a conjunction of planets ticks all the boxes. This, of course, is not proof that it was a conjunction that was the Star of Bethlehem, but it seems more likely than the other candidates. Let's have a look at the idea of conjunctions. Let's just remind ourselves about the basics. The very basic is, if two planets are going around the sun, the one that is closest to the sun moves faster. That is just the result of Newton's laws of motion, if you like. So if you're closer to the sun, you've got a stronger gravitational pull, you move faster, and you end up going round your orbit in less time than the orbit of an outer planet. So you could imagine, for instance, this is Earth and this is Mars. As seen from the sun, the two planets, of course, are now in the same part of the sky. As seen from the sun, the two planets are now in different parts of the sky, and every once in a while, those two planets will come together. If they were in the same plane, they would actually pass each other. But in fact, the orbit of the Earth and the orbit of Mars and the orbit of Jupiter and the orbit of Saturn are all slightly different. They're all, a few degrees different. And so planets can pass each other, but generally don't actually come close. They miss each other, usually by a degree or 2 or 3, in much the same way that the moon goes round the Earth in 1 month, but the moon doesn't cover the sun every month. We don't get a total eclipse of the sun every month, because generally speaking, the moon's orbit is tilted, and therefore the moon, as it goes round the Earth, will sometimes go below the sun, sometimes go above the sun. Only very rarely does it actually cover the disk of the sun and produce an eclipse. So although they're in the same part of the sky, don't think of them as getting particularly close to each other. And just to clarify the point made a moment ago, because inner planets move faster than outer planets, if we imagine that the green inner planet is the Earth and the red outer planet is Mars or Jupiter or Saturn, then because we're moving faster, although in general planets will go from west to east and go across the sky, because we can overtake it, a planet can stop, go backwards, stop again, and then continue forwards. So in general, it'll be moving from east to west through the sky. But whenever we get this situation that the sun and the Earth and the planet are close to a straight line, because the Earth is overtaking it on the inside lane, as it were, we get this peculiar situation where the normal motion of a planet from west to east temporarily gets halted, the planet stops in the sky, moves backwards for a while, stops again, and then continues to move forward. This is called retrograde motion. And because the orbit of the Earth is not so different from the orbit of the outer planets, they can literally stop in the sky and retrace their steps. So that's what we're moving towards in the thought of, is it possibly an explanation for an object stopping in the sky? For planets, it seems plausible. For comets, maybe, but not quite so easy to explain. So let's have a look at the timeline. What timeline are we trying to deal with? One thing you notice here is the timeline a few years BC here. There is no 0. If anybody gets out their planetarium software and tries to punch in what was the sky like in 2 BC or 1 BC, some astronomical software incorrectly inserts a year 0. So it does seem logical that if you go backwards from 3 AD to 2 AD to 1 AD, subtract another 1, you get 0. But there was no year 0. It jumps from 1 AD to 1 BC. So be careful. If you are going to use software to try and ratify anything I'm saying here, some software gets it wrong. So just bear that in mind. We've got quite a few years BC because we don't actually know when Christ was born. Some people think Christ was born somewhere between 8 BC and 4 BC, according to our current calendar. And that's mainly based on not being able to pin down the life of Christ, because, of course, there's no documentation that says Christ was born in 8 BC. There's nothing written down anywhere that says that. It's based on the fact that Christ was born before Herod died. That's sort of the only hard evidence we've got from the account in the Bible. All accounts seem to indicate Christ must have been born before Herod died. And a lot of people believe that Herod died in 4 BC. But some biblical scholars think otherwise. And I am not going to go back to the original Greek to try and make sense of it. I'm relying on other people doing their stuff. Some people think that Herod's death has been dated according to when a particular eclipse occurred, which occurred after a particular flood, which occurred after a particular famine or something. The early dates are not usually dated according to anything that we can get literally in stone. All dates are records of events that have happened. And some people believe that the eclipse that people assume was the eclipse that was in the same period as Herod's death was not the eclipse of 4 BC, but was the eclipse of 1 BC. So some people believe that Herod died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. And if you believe that Jesus was born shortly before Herod died, then you have a couple of periods in which Jesus might have been born. I have no idea why scholars don't think 3 to 4 BC is valid, but that is my understanding of what most people think. It's either of those two patches of grey where Jesus was born. So we're looking for an event that falls ideally into one of those two windows, if you like. So what are the possibilities? Well, certainly comets were around. Comets indeed are unpredictable and have tails, just like cats. We know where they are in general. We know where they are now, and we can calculate how long they take to go around the sun, and we can calculate where they were 2,000 years ago. It's very difficult to work out how long the tail was and how bright it would have been. So we can work out that they were there, but we can't work out how spectacular they would have been. There was a comet in 12 BC. That was Halley's Comet. And by all accounts, it was probably quite bright. But why would God post something on his Facebook page in 12 BC, many years before the birth of Christ? That seems like a little bit of a long head up, as it were, to actually tell people. There were two other comets which are possibilities in 5 and 4 BC. Comet here at 5 BC was Comet Holmes. Some of you might have seen Comet Holmes a few years back. It suddenly flared up and became very big. The coma expanded until it was about the size of the sun or something a few years back. Now, Comet Holmes was around at the time, but we don't think it was very bright. So it's unlikely that Comet Holmes was the source of the Star of Bethlehem. In 4 BC, there was another comet. This one was Churyumov-Gerasimenko, the mouthful that everybody else calls the Rosetta Comet, the one that Rosetta visited and the little Philae lander landed on the nucleus of the comet. So that was known to be around in 4 BC. But it's a very faint comet. Even now we can hardly see anything. It wouldn't have had much of a tail back then, and so we think that, although it was in the right place at the right time, would not have been a bright comet. So it's unlikely that that was the origin of the Star of Bethlehem. What about novae? Well, according to the Chinese, there was a nova in 5 BC, and according to the Koreans, there was a nova in 4 BC. Bright nova don't tend to come along very often. Maybe once every few decades, or maybe even every 100 or few hundred years. Is it likely that there was nothing interesting going on for hundreds of years, and then, like buses, two come along at once? It is perhaps more likely that this reflects the difficulty of dating anything that happened in these early days. The Chinese calendar is not the same as the Korean calendar, and they would have had particular astronomical events, such as these nova, relative to other events, and it's a question of trying to tie them together to try and work out exactly when these two things happened. It is generally thought that the likelihood of having two nova, one seen by the Chinese but not the Koreans, and the other seen by the Koreans but not the Chinese, that doesn't seem very likely. So it's much more likely that this was one nova and the dates are simply a little bit fluid by a few months. So there was a nova somewhere around 4-5 BC. But again, the records show it wasn't particularly bright, and there's no obvious reason why you would attach any strong astrological significance to a nova appearing in the sky. What about conjunctions? And here I'm using the symbols for brevity, the symbol for Jupiter, the symbol for Saturn, and the symbol for Venus, the astrological symbols. So there was a conjunction. That first little dumbbell symbol is the symbol for a conjunction. So there was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn, just like there was relatively recently, in about 6 BC. And a lot of people seem to think that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was possibly the origin of the Star of Bethlehem. Well, that is indeed a possibility, but I think this one is very, very interesting. It only works because it's 2 BC. It only works if King Herod died in 1 BC rather than 4 BC. Otherwise, that would be a sign of the birth of the King of the Jews after King Herod died, and it doesn't fit the Gospel of St. Matthew. But if King Herod died in 1 BC, then this one becomes a candidate. And I think this is interesting for a number of different reasons, which we'll now look at using the Starry Night software to look at the conjunction itself. This is a conjunction between Jupiter and Venus rather than Jupiter and Saturn. Jupiter, of course, one of the brightest planets in the night sky, genuine night sky away from the sun, and Venus, of course, when it's not too far away from the sun, is the brightest planet in the sky at sort of magnitude -4 and a bit. So let's have a look at what the sky might have looked like. We're going to look at the sky sort of 2-ish to 3-ish BC. If you can't read this, and I'm assuming you can't, we've currently got it set to the 1st of August, 3 BC, at about tea time. And I am not going to show the horizon, because I'm going to move forward day by day for quite a few months. And I don't want the horizon, and I don't want day and night flicking backwards and forwards, and I don't want the horizon leaping all over the place. In this particular planetarium software, I'm just fixated on what's happening in the constellation of Leo, because that's where these conjunctions take place. So I'm just looking at Leo. The ecliptic, where all the planets are doing their stuff, is a line going from bottom left to top right. Jupiter is labeled here as Jupiter. The other planets I haven't labeled, otherwise you get a screen full of labels, which is more confusing than anything else. Right in dead center, we have the constellation of Leo. The brightest star in Leo, at the bottom right of the constellation, is the star Regulus. And you can also see other constellations here. We've got Cancer. Gemini is chopped off to the right, Virgo over to the left. So in August of about 3 BC, we have Jupiter, and to its right we have Venus. And as time goes by, remember, inner planets move faster than outer planets, so in the sky Jupiter is trogging on its way from west to east, but Venus is about to overtake it in the sense of as seen from Earth. So Venus is going to catch up. If I run the video, then Jupiter is catching up Venus. And at this particular point in 3 BC, as seen in the early morning, because the sun is in the bottom left of this picture, it's not showing as sunrise in this particular case, but Jupiter and Venus are very close together in the sky, perhaps a fraction of a degree apart, closer than the diameter of a full moon, and they would be visible in the morning, in the east, before sunrise. For perhaps 1 hour before sunrise, they would appear above the horizon, get a little bit higher, and then the sun would come up, and then of course it would be difficult to see the planets. But for 1 hour in the morning, there would be a new star in the east, and this star is the result of Venus at magnitude -4 getting very close to Jupiter at magnitude -3-ish. Two very bright points of light getting very close together in the sky. And where does it happen? It happens in the constellation of Leo. Venus and Jupiter in Leo. Venus, birth. Jupiter, king. Leo, the land of Judea, the land of the Jews. So this might be interpreted by astrologers as Venus and Jupiter are doing something very interesting in Leo, birth of the king of the Jews. This is worth keeping an eye on, they thought to themselves. Let's keep an eye on what's going on. Something interesting might happen. What happens for the next few months? Let's run it forward. Venus is going faster than Jupiter, so Venus is going to go flying off to the left from west to east. Jupiter will continue trogging along. Jupiter is now getting close to the star Regulus. Jupiter passes very close to Regulus. The king of planets, Jupiter, has just passed the king of stars, Regulus. And Jupiter then stops in the sky. Because of the retrograde motion that we were talking about before, Jupiter stops moving from west to east. It stops in the sky and then starts moving from east to west for a little while, for a few more months. We're now in early 2 BC. And what happens? Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets passes the king of stars again. And then it ends its retrograde motion, stops in the sky for a second time, and then continues its west to east motion. And what does it do? It passes Regulus again. The king of planets passes the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times. It's not that unusual for Jupiter to go past Regulus, but now it's happened 3 times in relatively quick succession. Something interesting is happening with kings, the astrologers might say. Is this a sign of one king passing over to another king? Because we seem to have this little dance between the two kings. Definitely worth keeping an eye on what's going on next. Jupiter has done its little retrograde motion, and in the months it's taken to do that, Venus has gone round the sun and is coming back again. And Venus is now back in our field of view and is heading back towards Jupiter. And in the summer of 2 BC, along comes Venus, passes Regulus, and is in conjunction with Jupiter again. But this is not a close conjunction in the sense that the 2 points of light crept together and were, let's say, closer than the diameter of the full moon as 2 very bright points of light. This conjunction was exceptionally close, to the point where I'm not even sure it's happened again since. And the only way we can really convince you just how close this conjunction is to zoom in a little bit. Bear in mind that in this particular case, the planetarium software, I don't know where to base the observer. I don't know whether to put the observer in Jerusalem or in Persia or in India or in the Orient. So given that I don't know where on Earth we should be observing this from, I've simply taken the observer at the center of the Earth. And of course, there'll be a slightly different viewpoint depending on which country you happen to be in. But let's just have a look at how close Venus and Jupiter were in the night sky. Let me center them up and then zoom in. That's how close Jupiter and Venus got in the night sky. This field of view is less than an arc minute. I don't know of anybody who has the visual acuity to make out 2 objects that close as 2 separate objects. This particular planetarium software shows Venus as the surface of Venus rather than the blindingly white cloud decks of the planet Venus. But remember, Venus would be about magnitude -4, Jupiter -3, and they are only a fraction of an arc minute apart. So as far as human observers would be concerned, these 2 objects appear to come together in the sky and appear to merge as a single object, which would then be brighter than either Jupiter or Venus in isolation. And I don't know of any situation where 2 planets have come so close, the apparent positions of their disks seem to touch each other or overlap. So this would quite definitely have been an exceptional observation. Astrologers might have thought something is going on, birth of the king of the Jews, and then king of planets seems to have done a dance with the king of stars. Something is going on with kings. And then again, we have Jupiter and Venus in conjunction in the constellation of Leo. This is really cementing the fact that this is quite definitely something to do with the birth of the king of the Jews. And the fact that they have merged into one is so spectacular, no astrologer would have seen anything like it, probably in their own lifetimes. So let me recap what it is possible that the Magi saw. In August of 3 BC, there was a close, but perhaps not that spectacular conjunction. Again, similar to the one we saw of Saturn and Jupiter not that long ago. 2 very bright planets coming very close in the sky, night after night after night, and on one particular night, getting very close to each other. Jupiter and Venus in the constellation of Leo, giving rise to the astrological significance of birth king Jews. A few months later, the king of planets, Jupiter, would have gone past the king of stars, Regulus, not once, not twice, but 3 times over the period of that winter. And that might have been thought of being something to do with one king passing the crown to another king. And then the following summer, we have this spectacular conjunction of the same 2 planets again in the same constellation, this time merging as a single object that cannot be resolved as 2. They would come together, merge as a single bright object, and then separate again over the following days. Maybe that was the sign of stop watching the sky, go to Jerusalem, go to the land of Judea, and pay homage to this new king of the Jews. We don't know how long it would have taken the Magi to get to Jerusalem because we don't know where they came from. Some people say, oh, it's probably Persia. Could well have been Persia. We don't know if they are on foot. We don't know if they were on camels. If you believe Christmas cards, they're always on camels, but Christmas cards can lie. So we don't know how long it would have taken them to get to Bethlehem. What we do know is that later that year, the planet Jupiter did stop in the sky. Remember, the last point of the account of the Gospel of St. Matthew is that the star stopped in the sky. Well, Jupiter did stop in the sky in December. Now, whether or not it took a few months between the Magi deciding to leave and the Magi arriving at Bethlehem, who knows? But we do know the date on which Jupiter stopped in the sky. The date that Jupiter stopped in the sky was December the 25th. And of course, that is a complete fluke. There is no reason why it should be Christmas Day. It's simply the 25th of December. We know that later the Christians took over that particular pagan festival of the end of the longest night, etc. But it's an interesting coincidence that Jupiter stopped in the sky on the 25th of December. So perhaps that was the sequence that the astrologers saw, and that's why it got woven into the Gospel of St. Matthew regarding the Nativity, because these events took place, and perhaps this was handed down by word of mouth for some time. I can't remember exactly when the Gospel of St. Matthew was written, clearly not at the time of the Nativity, but sometime later. So maybe it was those conjunctions that inspired the account according to St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the other conjunction. Maybe it was a combination of conjunctions and other facts. Thank you very much. Maybe there was a conjunction and maybe there was a comet as well. We don't actually know whether or not a combination could have produced the Star of Bethlehem story. Determining the facts is easy. You can just get yourself a planetarium software, wind it back by 2,000 years, watch out for the fact that there's no year zero, think about where you're observing from, and then you'll find there's a very close conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, and indeed, a few years earlier, a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter. So determining the facts is easy because you can just run software backwards. Second-guessing the significance that the Magi or other astrologers would have applied to what they saw in the night sky, what we know is what was there. What we don't know is what they would have interpreted that as, what they would have taken as a sign that that is something worth going to Jerusalem or Bethlehem for. So we can only second guess, and there it is pure speculation as to what the astrologers were thinking when they saw these events in the sky. But regardless, of course, the message is the same, and I've had my 45 minutes, so I think I'll stop with a Merry Christmas to all. Thank you very much.